All right, so I don't really know how well you guys know Adolf Hitler in terms of if you just kind of know he's a bad guy and that's it. Maybe some of you guys know some of the details of his dictatorship. Maybe you guys know some things, but we're going to kind of just go on the premise that you guys know a little bit about him. He's not such a great guy, and we want to go into why he comes into power specifically in Germany throughout this time. Before I go on, I do want to just share a quick current events thing. It's going to take like 30 seconds for this. Since we just taught about FDR and his court packing plan, where FDR tried to put the Supreme Court justices, try to add 6 more. This just came out last night. So if you take a look at this headline, there's a law coming together, a bill right now to expand the Supreme Court justices from 9 to 13, put together by the Democrats and Joe Biden, basically to add some more Supreme Court justices. So I don't know if this is court packing round 2, but I just thought it was interesting because we had just done that, and now here it goes again. So it looks like there's a discussion. This is the first time a bill has been put in place since I think 1937, 38, when the first court packing took place. But it looks like it's happening again. So I'm not sure if this is a new, if you're actually about to see history unfold. There's some pros, there's some cons, but this is something that's going to become more involved in the news, and it's similar to what you guys just learned, so I thought that was interesting. All right, so keep an eye out for that in the news, but in just a very awkward transition back to World War II, you're always living through history, whether you realize it or not. And this is one of those times where, yes, I agree with what you're saying. You're definitely living through some history for sure, but I think that is something that could possibly come up in future classes for sure. All right, so how does Hitler come into power in Germany? So we have one slide for today, and then we're pretty much just doing an oversimplified video on Adolf Hitler, and I think it's excellent for really just seeing the steps of how he came into power. Okay, Liz Mel, yeah. So let's try and go over, who this guy is. Now, even though the focus question is centered around how he came into power, we actually want to take a look at some of his plans when he's the leader, because I think that will kind of give a sense on who he was. So I'm going to give you a minute. I'll be quiet. You guys can copy this down. What were his plans before World War II starts? And when you see his plans, you'll get a better sense of who he is and how he gets into power. All right, so I'll give you a minute to do that. Okay, so first off, one of his plans in Germany is to get rid of his political opposition. Anyone who disagreed with him, anyone who opposed Hitler was gotten rid of. In most times, they were just jailed, but in also times they were also killed. We'll learn about more of this tomorrow in some things called the Night of the Long Knives and some things along those lines. But ultimately, he was very against his political opponents. There wasn't really time for debate in German society. Whatever he said goes. All right, so if he said the brick was the color blue, you had to believe that the brick was the color blue. Okay, even though bricks are red, you had to go along with it. All right. Not only did you have to go along with Adolf Hitler, you had to show your support for him. So it wasn't just enough that you couldn't speak out against him. It wasn't just enough that you couldn't disagree with him openly. You had to publicly support him. All right, this is pretty much any picture like this is pretty famous, but here's a picture of Adolf Hitler walking, and they're all giving him the Hail Hitler, the Nazi salute. If you did not give them this salute, the SS, or the Gestapo as they're known, will come along and basically arrest you, okay, for not was in love with this guy, and some did. Don't get me wrong. Some did love this guy. Some people really did like him. But ultimately, people were doing this more out of fear. Okay, if you did not go along with his policies, if you did not show public support for him, you were thrown in jail or killed. All right? There is no freedom of speech throughout this time, guys. No freedom of speech. Okay, so you couldn't speak out against him. You had to go along with what he said. Number 2, he needed Lebensraum. Okay, what that means is he needs more space for the German people. So ultimately, Germany is one of the bigger European countries. If you can see my mouse right here, it's this black country right here. It's one of the biggest countries in Europe, but relatively to the United States, it's not very big. Relatively to Russia, relatively to some other big countries, it's not very big. So he said if he wants to make Germany a stronger country, he needs more Lebensraum, or more space for German people. And the way he went about doing this was actually invading his neighboring countries, which, if you don't know, is an act of war. All right. But we talked about, what makes a country a fascist country. You need to have a very strong military. Germany's military was so much stronger than Austria, so much stronger than Czechoslovakia. He pretty much took them over without a problem. Okay. So ultimately, Germany is going to take over land surrounding them. And this is a huge reason why we'll get into World War II. But before World War II, this was his kind of plan. He's like, okay, we need more space in Germany. We're going to take over some of these other countries, and let's see what happens. Okay. Number 3, he tried to restore German greatness by rebuilding the military. After the Treaty of Versailles, Germany's military was extremely weak. They didn't have a lot of men. They didn't have a lot of supplies. And his first thing was to really build that back up because, no country's intimidating or no person's intimidating without a military behind them. All right. Once he builds up the military, he's able to start doing some of these things that maybe are not so good. All right. He also would not only build up the military, he tried to build up and restore German confidence. After the Treaty of Versailles, German confidence was very low. People were very poor. People were struggling. And basically, he comes around saying he's going to fix everything. And he blames pretty much all of the other people for Germany's problems. He blames some of the other countries. He's going to blame a certain group of people very shortly, you're going to learn about, that is going to become the huge crux of his hatred, okay, which we'll talk about soon. But ultimately, he would say to the German people, it's not your fault Germany's been struggling. It's that stupid Treaty of Versailles. It's these groups of people who have it out for Germany. That's why we're struggling. When people are struggling, the best thing to do is usually blame yourself. But many people don't do that. I gave you the example, when people are struggling in school, the first thing they blame is the teacher. And ultimately, they should probably look back at how they're doing and how they're living their life. But Germany would blame others. Okay, and this was led by Adolf Hitler, and basically Hitler said that, if you put me in office, I'll fix all of your problems, so to speak. Okay. Number 4, he wanted one master race. He didn't want any diversity. Okay, America is a country that has a ton of diversity. Just look at PS89. Okay, look at all the people in the chat room right now. Think of all the different cultures that are mixing together. That's a big function of why America is, I think, such a great country. But ultimately, his country did not want any of that. He thought that races were stronger than others, where in our case, we know that people come from different races and cultures, but we don't believe one race or culture to be better than one another. And if someone does, there's something seriously wrong with them. I have no problem saying that. All right. Germany and Hitler believed that there was one master race, okay, and that master race was supposed to be the leaders of the world. So they're based off of like rankings, I guess you'd say. The group that he considered to be the master race was the German Aryan race, which we'll talk about in the video soon. The Aryan race is basically a white person who has blonde hair and blue eyes. That's the group that he considered to be the strongest race. Okay? Now, let me ask you guys in the chat, why is that ironic? Why is that ironic? And I'll go back to this picture to help you out. He doesn't have those features. Correct. He is not blonde hair and blue-eyed. He's brown-eyed and brown-haired. All right, so he did not even himself have those features. So even he believed he was not a part of the master race. But basically, if you were a white person, if you were a white German, you were not the master race, but you were maybe just one step below, and then you'll be looked at as a very powerful race. So he basically wanted Germany to all look like this. Okay, white, blue eyes, blonde hair, and if he had some other white people mixed in, that's perfectly fine. But he did not want diversity of cultures. No one from the Middle East, no one that's black, no one that's Hispanic. Pretty much anyone that was not white was kind of, thrown to the side. The group he disliked the most were the Jewish people, which we're going to spend a lot of time on tomorrow. So I don't want to get too much into details with that. But basically, he blamed the Jewish people for everything wrong in Germany, and that would lead to something called his final solution. Okay, which we'll get into for tomorrow's lesson. Tomorrow is a Friday, but tomorrow will be one of the saddest lessons you maybe ever learned, let alone one of the saddest lessons you learn in my class tomorrow. And if you know kind of what I'm getting at, you'll know it's coming. If you don't know what's going on, that's okay. We'll go all into it tomorrow, but understand it's going to be a sad, sad lesson. There's a few of those in this unit. Okay, there's a few of those in this unit, and this just happens to be one of the first ones. Okay. So this is a very straightforward lesson. Okay, this is a very straightforward lesson. We are doing the oversimplified video on Adolf Hitler. I think they honestly, in 12 minutes, do a really fantastic job taking a very bad person and then kind of giving kids a good understanding of how this guy gets into power and then how he kind of goes about doing things. Those are the only notes for today. Yes, we're continuing this lesson tomorrow. Oh, Neve, let's talk about that tomorrow. Let's talk about that tomorrow. We can spend the whole course on that question. But let's kind of get into more of who he was and his understanding, and maybe we can start coming up to your own determination, because basically, Neve, you're correct. There isn't one direct reason why he chose the Jewish people out of all the people. So we're going to try and put our best guesses forward tomorrow. All right. So the oversimplified video is brought into two parts. Now, at times it's a little funny. At times it's meant to make you laugh. That's okay. Hitler's a very serious situation, obviously, but I think kind of seeing how he goes from being a young child, as you see, a baby boy here, and how he, lived throughout his life eventually led him to be, one of the most evil and corrupt politicians of all time. No, Sanjita, I should make that clear. You have a separate lesson tomorrow, but this is going, listen, you're going to finish this assignment by the end of the period if you just follow along with me. So no one will have any other work. All right, you'll have a separate lesson tomorrow on something different. All right, so let's look at how this goes. Preview questions 1 and 2 in part 1, and let's get through it.
So gentle, so innocent. You'd think this child would grow up to become a good man, an honest man. Well, think again. Hitler was born Adolphus Hitler in 1889 in a small town in Austria-Hungary. His father, Alois Schicklgruber, was born out of wedlock, but eventually changed his name to that of his stepfather, becoming Alois Hitler. Alois was a mid-level Austrian customs officer, not really rolling in cash, but certainly rolling in women. He married a rich, older lady, but then immediately started having affairs, including one with a much younger house servant. A few years later, he left his sick wife to be with his mistress, but since the Catholic Church didn't allow divorce at the time, he couldn't marry her. So he waited for his old wife to die and had a child in the meantime. Then his wife died, so he married his mistress and had another child, but then his new wife got sick, so he employed his much younger cousin Clara to take care of her. Then when his new wife died, he immediately got Clara, his cousin, pregnant, and then married her. In that order, you rock star. Clara and Alois had 3 children together, who all tragically died while in infancy. So when the 4th child, Adolf, came along, Clara spoiled him rotten. The Hitlers had 2 more kids, and the family moved around a few times, meaning Adolf had to attend 5 different elementary schools. Adolf's father was strict, quick to anger, and took most of it out on the eldest son, until he had enough and ran away at the age of 14, leaving 7-year-old Adolf to do most of the chores and get berated by his father. The result was a difficult relationship with his dad, while he was super attached to his mother, who worried over him and his health excessively. Hitler did well in school at first. His grades were good and his teachers praised him. He was popular with the other kids and enjoyed gathering them together to play war games. He also loved reading, and particularly liked stories about cowboys and Indians. As he grew older though, he started to get into trouble. He was caught smoking once, organized a raid on a local orchard, tormented his pro-Austria religion teacher with symbolic gestures, displaying his allegiance to the idea of united Germanic people under a greater German state in defiance of Habsburg Austria. You know, the usual. All of this enraged Adolf's father, who punished him severely. The area of Austria-Hungary that Hitler lived in was once part of the German Confederation, and many of the people who lived there considered themselves to be German. Adolf tended to just go against whatever his father said, and since his father was an Austrian public official, Hitler got big into German nationalism. This enraged Adolf's father, who punished him severely. Around this time, a family tragedy struck. His 6-year-old brother, whom he loved a lot, died of measles when Adolf was 10, and was buried in the cemetery just across from their home. Around this time,
Okay, so interesting start to Adolf's life. Obviously, besides his, mom and dad being cousins, which isn't great, that's definitely not helpful. He was, number one, not actually born in Germany. He was born in the country of Austria, not Australia. Okay, not Australia. Austria is a country in Europe that borders Germany, and many people believed in the area that he was born that they were actually from Germany because that's where it used to be a part of. Okay. Describe Adolf Hitler's relationship with his family. Really bad. Okay, father was abusive. Now, in no way am I saying this is an excuse for Hitler becoming the way he did. I'm not, because there's plenty of children who have tough times with their families and turn out just fine. But you can kind of see the steps that go on. Okay, cousins. Okay, had a child. Okay, father was very abusive. Okay, and now you're going to see one of his young siblings passes away, which definitely causes some issues for him. Take a look at 3 and 4.
Neighbors reported a change in the young boy. Strange behaviors such as talking to trees and staying up late staring at the stars from the cemetery walls. He lost interest in religion, and his school grades started to decline, which enraged his father, who punished him severely. It also didn't help that he had just entered high school, and the cool city boys treated him like a rural peasant. He had to repeat a grade and had little interest in most school subjects, instead spending his time reading and drawing, which he was quite good at. One day his father said, "Son, someday you'll be a big balls public official like me." And Adolf replied, "No, father, I'm going to become an artist and soar high above the clouds with the eagles." This enraged his father, but by this time he was an old-ass man, so he just sort of let it go, and then died of a lung hemorrhage. Hitler just about passed his final semester and celebrated in the typical way by getting blackout drunk and wiping his ass with the certificate. However, he didn't take the overall final school exam, instead just dropping out. The now 16-year-old boy was unemployed, without much purpose in life, and for the next 3 years he stayed that way. He spent most of his time at the opera with his only friend, August Kubizek. Kubizek later wrote his memories of the young Hitler and said he was passionately interested in many things, felt he was in many ways better than others his age, was quick to anger just like his father, and an incredible speaker once he was ranting. When he was 18, he said a very sad goodbye to his mother and went to Vienna to take the entrance exam for art school. He failed. Soon after, he had to return home. His mother was sick and her health was rapidly deteriorating. Hitler stayed by her side, and when she eventually died, the family doctor said he had never seen someone so overwhelmed with grief as Hitler was. Then Hitler returned to Vienna, still hoping to find a career in the arts, but he never did. Instead, without parental support, Hitler ended up on the streets. Now in his early 20s, he spent a few rough years living in and out of homeless shelters, making what little he could from selling postcards he painted. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when and how Hitler's extreme ideological beliefs formed, but his time in Vienna would have certainly played a role. Anti-Semitism was widespread in the city. The mayor, whom Hitler supported, was an outspoken anti-Semite. There were many right-wing anti-Semitic newsletters, which Hitler took a keen interest in. He bought into the conspiracy theories and became a firm believer in the idea that there are many races in constant struggle with one another, the purest of which were the German Aryan people, and the worst of which, he believed, were Jews. Since Austria-Hungary was a multi-ethnic empire full of lesser races, Hitler wasn't a fan. So when he was 24,
Okay, so number 3, what type of school did Hitler want to attend in college? He wanted to attend art school. And you don't know how history is going to go, but many people kind of speculate that if he did go to art school and if he passed art school and whatever, maybe he goes as a painter and ends up not causing World War II, basically. We don't know if that's how it's going to go, but that's kind of the idea that, if Hitler had just passed art school, then none of this would have ever happened. We can't vouch for that, but it's definitely a possibility. Who did Hitler think was the best race? That would be the Aryan race. We've talked about that. And the worst race is the Jewish race. Okay, which we'll talk more about that tomorrow. Okay, the area where he lives was a very diverse area, and he didn't really like that too much. Okay, a lot of different races in there. So take a look at 5 and 6 before we get into part 2.
He moved to Munich in Germany to avoid doing military service, and for one more year he was a drifter on the streets, until something huge happened. In 1914, long-standing tensions in Europe erupted into the First World War. Crowds across Europe celebrated the news. Within days, Hitler volunteered for the German army. The war gave him a purpose in life. His fellow soldiers gave him friendship and brotherhood. Despite the horrors of war, Hitler considered it to be the best time of his life. He was reportedly a brave soldier and was awarded the Iron Cross, first class. He was also very lucky and had many close encounters with death. His luck ran out in 1916, however, when an artillery shell injured his leg. He went back to Germany to recover and was outraged to find a general apathetic anti-war attitude among the exhausted and hungry German populace. With the war turning against Germany, he returned to the front lines, but was temporarily blinded by a British gas attack in 1918. A month later, still recovering in hospital, Hitler learned of Germany's defeat and surrender. The terms of the peace treaty were tough on Germany and humiliated the German people. Europe's borders changed after the war too. New countries were formed out of Russia's lost territory, Austria-Hungary was dissolved, and there was one big new country splitting Germany into two. Hitler, seeing the country he loved humiliated like this, said that hatred grew in him for those responsible, by which he meant communists and Jews, who he believed had stabbed Germany in the back by spreading dissent and anti-war propaganda back home.
Okay, so number 5, what war did Hitler fight in prior to World War II? That would be World War I. And to be honest, guys, he was a pretty good soldier. They said he was pretty brave. He had a couple of close encounters with death. Again, another one of those, maybe World War II doesn't happen if, he had been killed in those battles. We would never even think twice about it, but that is not how it went down. What two groups of people did Hitler blame for Germany's loss? The communists in Germany, and the Jewish people in Germany. Which I guess would say is an argument based on emotion and not many facts, because not really many communists and Jews really had to do much with World War I. But, when you believe something, that's what ends up happening. So he believed those two groups. Now, remember, communism and fascism are similar in terms of government control. So a lot of people are similar, but they can't stand one another. So it's pretty straightforward that he would not like the communists very much either. All right. Now that we see kind of his early life, now we'll start to see how he becomes the dictator of Germany. Okay, that's going to be here in part 2 coming up shortly. All right, we may have an ad though, sorry.
So, you took my masterclass and learned to make egg toast really good. Delicious. That's cool.
Since Germany's military had to be reduced, Hitler could no longer remain a soldier after the war, but he kept working for the army as an informant. After the war, communists in Germany had attempted a revolution, and the government was worried about communism in general. So Hitler was tasked with infiltrating and reporting on any new political parties that could pose a communist threat. A new party called the German Workers' Party threw up a whole bunch of red flags, so Hitler went along to one of their meetings, but found that they weren't communist at all. They were extreme right and shared many of his extreme beliefs, so he left the army and signed up to join the party. His fantastic speaking abilities impressed the party's leadership and supporters, and he very quickly rose to the top. He decided the party needed a makeover, so he renamed it to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi for short, and he gave it a new color scheme. The Nazis weren't very specific on policy, but Hitler made extravagant promises to return Germany to its former glory by undoing the Treaty of Versailles and reuniting all ethnic Germans into one nation. He also said that only pure Aryan people should be allowed to be citizens and that all Jews would lose their citizenship. These ideas were already common in extreme right politics, but what set the Nazis apart was Hitler himself, and they quickly became the leading party on the extreme right. Many of the political parties in Germany at the time had paramilitary wings, and the Nazis were no different. Hitler set up the very descriptive Whole Protection Detachment, later changed to the very delightful Gymnastic and Sports Division, and finally settling on the ominous Storm Detachment, or SA for short. Their job was to defend Nazi party meetings and intimidate political opponents, and they would frequently engage in battles with communists on the streets. Since the Allies had demanded a reduction in Germany's military size, many trained soldiers were left unemployed. They liked the Nazi ideology, and it was only natural for them to join the SA, which grew larger and larger over time. The new democratic government that formed after World
Okay, so number 1, the German Workers' Party eventually changed its name to the very famous Nazi Party. So that was the political party that eventually took control of Germany, and it became Nazi Germany. Number 2, what was the Storm Detachment or SA's job for Hitler? So basically, they were former military soldiers It was like the police, but just for a political party. So picture in our country that if the Democrats had a police for their political party, or the Republicans had a police for their political party. The police usually work for the government, the state governments, not for political parties, but not in Germany. It was different. So they were the police to protect Hitler and intimidate political opponents. To be honest, really just the Communist Party. Okay, you're going to see those are the two big parties that developed because the Weimar Republic in Germany, we know fails. Germany used to be a republic, but it fails and does not do a good job. All right, you're going to see something come up here. I'm going to pause, but take a look at 3 and 4.
World War I was pretty weak and ineffective. In order to pay reparations to the Allies, it started printing more money. The problem is that printing money doesn't actually give a country more money, it just makes money less valuable. So as the country printed more and more money, it became worth less and less, and the currency crashed. In 1919, $1 US was worth about 4 German marks. By December 1923, $1 US was equal to 4.2 trillion marks.
Okay, so if you're ever from the thought like, hey, you know, we've talked about this in class, but hey, if you owe money, just print more money. That's the worst thing you could do because that makes the value of everything less valuable. So, you know, 4.5 marks is equal to $1 in American society. Now look at it. Because all they did was Germany is they printed a ton of money and that led to inflation to pay back the reparations. And it made Germany so incredibly poor, guys. Okay? Yeah, it's very bad.
The price of bread rose to 200 billion marks. Banknotes became worthless. Unsurprisingly, in such an economic crisis, Germany struggled to pay the Allies. The French were pissed about this, so they occupied the Ruhr, an area full of factories, and took the economic output from the area as payment. They treated the German civilians badly, and in total, approximately 130 Germans were killed during the occupation. Germans were furious, and Hitler and the Nazis thought that now would be a great time to lead a revolution. In November 1923, inspired by something a certain bold Italian man did a year earlier, Hitler stormed a meeting at a beer hall and called for an uprising against the government. With his supporters, he marched on the streets of Munich, hoping the police would join his side. They did not. Hitler was put on trial for treason. He could have been sentenced to life, but the right-wing judges thought he was a pretty cool guy. Hitler knew the judges and knew that they would be lenient, so he took the opportunity to make impassioned speeches during the trial. And in the end, he was sentenced to just 5 years in prison, of which he only served 9 months, and when I say prison, it was more like a pleasant hotel stay where he had plenty of time to write a book. The whole affair was covered by the media nationwide, and it made Hitler famous. Hitler and his extreme message were now known throughout Germany. But the everyday German still didn't care much for him. In the 1928 election, the Nazis only won about 2% of the vote. Many were still intimidated by all the violence and the shouting and how unpolitician-like he was. But a new economic crisis would change all of that. To help Germany pay its reparations, America agreed to give it loans. In October 1929, the Wall Street crash happened, and America wanted its money back. The economic strain this put on an already struggling Germany was severe. Unemployment skyrocketed, poverty was widespread, and Germans were sick of it. It was clear that the newly formed democracy wasn't working. In the face of crisis, Germans began moving to the political extremes. If you were German and wanted change, your choices now were either the communists or the Nazis. Hitler claimed that he was the only one who could return Germany to its former glory. The Nazi Party used propaganda to make Hitler seem like a great and powerful man, and they gave the German people a scapegoat to blame for all their suffering. The promise of a single strong dictator was a breath of fresh air for Germans after years of failing democracy. Some bought into his extreme ideology. Some didn't agree with the racism, but were willing to vote for him anyway. Many didn't know much about politics at all, but just got caught up in the hype. Election after election, the Nazis became more and more popular, until in 1932, they became the biggest party in the German.
Okay, so you see that Nazi party start to gain a little popularity over the 4 to 6 years. Number 3, how long did Hitler serve in jail? This is another one of those things in history that, the dude tried to commit a revolution in his country. That's treason. Even in the United States, that's punishable by death, right? If you try and overthrow the government, he gets 5 years in jail and only serves 9 months. That's absurd. That's absurd. That's another one of those things. If, hey, they gave him 20 years in jail, World War II doesn't happen. So you just see the perfect timeline of events to lead to World War II here. Why did Germany want to get rid of their democratic government? Ultimately, it wasn't working. People were very poor. We know this. When people are struggling and people not doing well, they want major change. And this major change came to a clash between either Germany becoming communist on the alt-left or fascist on the alt-right. And hopefully you guys know what eventually it becomes. It does become fascist. All right, number 5. So this is crazy. This is how he gets into power. He doesn't get elected into power. He runs for president. He's going to lose, but he gets named something else in government. And then from there, there's a perfect storm of events to get him to become the dictator. So watch how this unfolds for 5 and 6.
In Parliament, Hitler came to truly believe that he was some sort of great, destined savior of Germany. He turned megalomaniac. He decided to run for president and did surprisingly well, but still lost to the extremely popular World War I general Paul von Hindenburg. Since he was now the leader of the biggest party though, he demanded President Hindenburg make him chancellor. But Hindenburg was reluctant, seeing that Hitler was clearly such a big racist. Industry leaders urged Hindenburg to give Hitler the chancellorship, fearing the rising support for communism, and leader of the Center Party von Papen, who had been secretly negotiating with Hitler, said to Hindenburg, "How about we make Hitler chancellor on the condition that I get to be vice-chancellor and most government jobs go to us moderate conservatives? That way, I'll get to keep my power, we'll get to keep our power and we'll control Hitler like he's our angry little puppet." What could possibly go wrong? As it turned out, everything. Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, but he was not yet a dictator. In February, the German parliament building was set on fire. Historians still aren't sure who did it, and many suspect the Nazis did it themselves, but Hitler blamed the communists, and he convinced President Hindenburg to sign an emergency decree allowing him to imprison all communists and other political opponents. Communists and others were sent off to the first concentration camp in Dachau. At this time, the elderly President Hindenburg passed away, giving Hitler the perfect opportunity. He introduced a law to parliament that would allow him to make all future laws and decisions entirely on his own. With his political opponents imprisoned and the SA intimidating others, Hitler's law passed. Just 2 months after becoming chancellor, Hitler was now a dictator.
Okay, so let's go through this again so we make sure. So number 5, he gets elected as the chancellor, or put into power as the chancellor, someone who works for the president of Germany. Now, over the next 2 months is going to be a span of maybe the unluckiest things in world history. There's going to be a fire at a building, a congressional building in Germany. No one really knows who did it, but people suspect it was Hitler and the Nazis. No one could prove it, but Hitler was able to convince the president that it was the Communist Party in the country who did it. So you know what happened to all the communist people? They got thrown in jail. You ready for this? So when they get thrown in jail, Hitler has no political opponents. All his political opponents are in jail. So now you ready for this bad luck? Paul von Hindenburg is going to die. Not because of anything he did wrong, because he had lung cancer. So he dies. All right? So now there's no constitution in Germany who really goes over who's next in charge. So you know what does Hitler do? He proposes a law called, for number 6, the Enabling Act. And basically it says he can now have power in Germany. He is now going to become a dictator. And because all of his political opponents are thrown in jail, no one could speak out against it. All right, you see how crazy that is? In just a span of 2 months, he went from being just someone in government to being the most powerful man in Germany. 2 months, that's all it took. From, honestly, let's just call it what it is, guys. Some very crafty moves by him politically. He got all of his opponents thrown in jail, and then when a stroke of bad luck happened and the president died, he was right there to take over. Okay, and that's how he gets into power. Let's finish 7 and 8 here and start seeing what he does with some of these power when he gets into power here.
He still had one problem. The leader of the SA wanted the SA to take over the job of the regular German army, and the German army didn't like that idea. Hitler needed to maintain the support of his professionally trained German army, more so than his rough and rowdy SA. So one night in June 1934, he had Röhm and many other of his own SA officers rounded up and murdered. While he was at it, he took the opportunity to brutally settle some personal scores as well. Politicians who had disagreed with him in the past, reporters who had printed negative articles about him, one guy who did absolutely nothing, but they thought he was someone else. In some cases, even their families were murdered. In total, up to 200 people were killed in what became known as the Night of the Long Knives. The army, now satisfied that they wouldn't be replaced, pledged total allegiance to their new Führer, and Hitler's control was now absolute. Life in Germany changed violently. Freedom of the press, expression, and public assembly were suspended. Jews were initially branded and their businesses boycotted, and eventually Hitler would go on to have 6 million Jewish men, women, and children killed in concentration camps. Hundreds of thousands of people were forced into sterilization for physical and mental imperfections. The Hitler Youth became a way to brainwash the young. Boys were trained to fight and returned home from camp violent. Girls were told their purpose was to have many pure Aryan children, and they would sometimes return from camp pregnant. When their parents were understandably horrified, their children would threaten to turn them over to the Gestapo for standing in the way of Germany's greatness. The standard greeting changed, and you could be sent to a concentration camp for not using it. This way, it seemed like everyone was a Nazi supporter. If you dared oppose Hitler or speak out against him in any way, you also would be sent to a concentration camp. German nationalism captivated the young Adolf. Extreme ideology and anti-Semitism festered in him as a young man living a hard life on the streets. Germany's defeat in the First World War filled him with hatred and a thirst for vengeance. A political movement that treated him like a god, and hundreds of thousands looking up to him as their savior, made him a megalomaniac. And soon, his aggressive foreign policies would drag the world into a second tragic global conflict, otherwise known as
Okay, that's where we're ending. Number 7, what happened to the people that were against Hitler during the Night of the Long Knives? He killed his biggest political opponents in Germany. Killed them. Just got rid of them. Okay, if they had opposed Hitler in the past, they were killed. And when I mean Night of the Long Knives, it like all happened within like a couple of nights. It's crazy. Number 8, what was the name given to a group of children trained to become stronger Germans? That would be the Hitler Youth. Kids just your age that were sent to basically the summer camps, I guess you can kind of call them, where they were trained to be better Germans. Boys were trained to fight. Girls were of those women came back pregnant. Guys, think about how old you are. Okay, think about coming home pregnant after a summer camp because you were pretty much forced to. Okay, that's horrible. Sure, I'll post it again. So 7 is he killed his biggest opponents in Germany. And number 8 is the Hitler Youth. I'm posting it here again. Thank you for doing that. I'm sorry if I cut off. All this will be on YouTube if I cut off at any point. We're going into a very sad lesson tomorrow called the Holocaust. I'm 1 minute over. I apologize about that. Neve, I believe he did have children. Hang on one sec. I think it's 2. I think it's 2. Nope, sorry. He had a total of 6, but there's only really 2 with his main first wife. There was a couple of others. Were they a part of the Aryan race? No, some of them weren't because he had black hair and brown eyes, right? You know, so he didn't. All right. So I did go over. I want you guys to go. You guys have a good rest of your day. If you have any questions about this, you can email me. We can discuss more, but I will see you all tomorrow. Bye-bye.